Welcome to the Oriire podcast, the podcast that tells African stories. I'm Ceci.
And I'm Halima. And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing about a Ghanaian mythological figure called Anansi. And we have a special guest with us discussing this topic. So, hi, Cynthia. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm from Ghana. I am from the Ewe tribe. However, the topic of discussion today is from the Akan tribe, which I'm very familiar with as well. So I'm generally excited to be here and talk about Africa and Ghana in general.
Thank you. We're excited to have you. Cynthia, do you speak Chui? I know you speak Ewe, but do you speak Chui?
I speak Ewe, I speak Chui, and I speak Ga.
Ooh, that's so cool. So Akwaba, I only know Chui. Well, just like Chui. Okay, so do you want to give us like a quick backstory about Anansi?
Yeah, so basically I've been hearing Anansi stories since I was a child, mostly from my mom. When I go to my village, my grandma likes to do this thing where you guys know in the village there's barely electricity, so a lot of times we just sit under the moonlight and listen to all these stories. And my grandma used to tell us a lot of Anansi stories. And so basically, Anansi is a godlike figure. The way in which I heard the story, it was he's basically in the form of a spider and a man. So it's like a hybrid of both. When I was little, I used to hear these stories just as they are, and I thought they were funny. But as I grew up, I got to see deeper into it and learn more about it. So we'll probably cover that later on. Mm-hmm. But an example of one of his stories was in the beginning, which is like the first story that we ever heard, was that Nyame, who in Akan means God, was the owner of all stories, basically the king of all stories. He had all the stories. And Anansi was also a god who, he was a trickster god who thought that he wanted to have all the stories. And so he wanted to cut a deal with Nyame to get those stories from him. And so he went to Nyame and says, I want to purchase all your stories. And Nyame says, well, it's very expensive. There's so many important people who have tried this and have failed. So do you think you can? And Anansi says, yeah, I can do it. So he tells him, okay, so there are three things that I want from you. The first one is the honeybee. I forgot what the Akan name for honeybee is. The second one was onini, which means snake or python. And then the third one is osibo, which was the tiger. So he asked Anansi to go and bring these animals to him if he could. So Anansi, being a trickster, he decided to go about it the smart way. So he went to the honeybees and then he had like a gourd and he sprinkled like some water outside of the honeybees hive and on himself as well. And some of the honeybees flew out and he asked them, why are you deciding to stay in your hive when it's so wet? And they were like, oh, we have nowhere else to go. And he says, okay, so I have this gourd for you. Go inside it and be dry, basically. So they all fly into the gourd and then he covers it up. And then he's like, wow, you guys are so stupid. Probably didn't say it like that. But so then he took the gourd to Nyame and says, I've brought you your first request. Mm-hmm. And then he says, okay, you still have the python and the tiger on there. So then he goes back into the forest and then he starts arguing with himself whilst passing by the abode of the python. And the python was like, why are you arguing with yourself? And he was like, oh, my wife says that you're too weak and too short than, basically you're too weak and you're shorter than this stick that I'm holding. And the python was like, okay, that's impossible. So we would basically research that theory, or we would confirm that theory.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically he lies next to the stick, and then Anansi was like, it seems you are shorter than this stick. And then the python says, oh, I'll actually stretch myself to prove that I am taller or longer than the stick. And then Anansi says, okay, it seems you keep slipping. Like when you stretch to the back, you get shorter in the front. So I will tie you to the stick in order to get a better measurement. And the python says, oh, that's a good idea. Although it wasn't. Anansi tied the python to the stick, and now he told the python that, well, you were so stupid because now I have captured you and I can take you to Nyame. So he takes the python to Nyame as well, and Nyame was like, that's quite impressive. However, you still have the last thing, which is Osebo on the list. So then he goes back to the forest, he digs a pit, and then he covers it up with dirt and makes it seem natural. He did that on the path that Osebo usually uses to go hunting. So the tiger, walking about, just minding his business, just falls into the pit. And then Anansi waited till like night time, and then he casually passed by. He was like, oh, Osebo, what are you doing in this pit? And then the tiger says, the tiger meaning Osebo, says, oh, I just fell into this pit unknowingly, so please help me out. And then Anansi says, I don't trust you. If I help you out, you will devour me and my family. And then Osebo says, no, I promise you, I would never. And he says, okay. So Anansi tied a rope to a tree branch and held it down with a stone, and then gives the other end to the rope to Osebo and tells him to tie this around his tail. So Osebo does that. And then when Anansi obviously took off the rock from the branch, it kind of like, how should I even explain this? It kind of catapulted Osebo out of the pit and then around, just hanging on the tree branch. So he kept dangling and dangling and dangling until he got very dizzy. And then Anansi says, well, he got dizzy and unconscious, she says. And so Anansi was able to cut him off and then tie his legs up properly, and then he carried him to Nyame. And so Nyame says, wow, you were able to bring everything on the list. And so now I give you this huge book of stories. And he hands the stories to Anansi. And now Anansi is not only the trickster god, but he also now has all the stories. And so basically, in not even just the Akans, in general Ghanaian culture, when someone tells you a story, they usually attribute that story to Anansi. So that was how the word Anansi Sam was, that's where it was derived from. So now when someone says Anansi Sam, they say story, even though the direct translation is Anansi's stories.
Ooh, wow.
That's actually really, really interesting. I really like that story. And it makes me wonder as well, like, why do you think that so many cultures all have, they all have a trickster god? You know what I mean? Even within African cultures, why do they feel like there's a need for that figure in all the pantheons? Like, what do they represent really?
Yes, I think it is popular because mostly of the symbolism. It tells us the importance of stories, because these trickster gods, basically the way in which they operate or do their things is through stories. Like Anansi, if he wants to con you, he doesn't just up and con you. He makes it into a story form, something interesting. And so I think that is mainly the reason why they like to tell stories about him or about trickster gods. And aside from that, the symbol of what he does, like, I don't even know how to explain it properly, but
I think
if you look at how,
help you with that, like, I think what maybe the symbol is that they need to be clever, I guess. Like,
they emphasize wit over,
use your wit, exactly, instead of, it's not just about
instead of strength.
Everything. Yes,
that's true. And a lot of Anansi stories, you would see that it's mostly about him showing how selfish he is and conning people and things like that. But at the same time, it emphasizes the fact that if you do something and you do it smartly, you can even get away with something that's bad. So you can be doing something that's bad, but if you do it smartly, you can even get away with it. So I think that is one of the big themes around Anansi.
I think that's very true and very interesting. But I also think that folk tales, a lot of them is like stories told to children. And basically, just a running theme whenever we talk about folk tales is just really, they are kind of awful lessons to teach children. In that, like, just make sure you do your whatever you're doing, do it like in a smart way so you can get away with it, whether it's bad or not, rather than teaching children to be upright and honest and blah, blah, blah. But you know what? Yeah.
So they are mostly cautionary tales, even though they do it in a bad way. But as I said, as I grew up more, I have like a different perception looking back at the stories that I've been told. I see like a deeper meaning to some of them, not all of them, some of them.
Do you mind sharing with us what like deeper meanings you have to Anansi stories?
Yeah, so for like society in general, I realized that in the African culture, one of the reasons why they told these stories the way in which they did was for posterity. Like if you look at most of these stories, if they didn't tell it in the way they did, like added a little bit of embellishments and lies and not lies, like just things that when you think about it, you realize this is really not possible. But the reason why they told those stories that way was for posterity. If they hadn't told it like that, it would have probably not made it to this point.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, like with Anansi, he's depicted as someone who is half man, half spider. But then I think with the spider, with the multiple limbs, just represents someone who has multiple traits and could melt into different characters, which is what we see in most of his stories. And the spider being able to weave webs, just represents the web of lies that he's able to tell, and not even just the web of lies, but also with the way spiders are able to capture their prey with lies, like with their webs, like to capture their prey in their webs. And that's basically most of what Anansi does. You can be minding your business and he just he just comes to you with his
ways.
things, with his ways. And so there's a lot of symbolism there. And I wonder if they thought about it that way when they told the stories. But then for most of these people who started these stories, it was very real to them. So now that the stories have made it way back from history till now, it probably means something differently to us. But again, most of them told this as a cautionary tale. Like my grandmom, I'm pretty sure she never really believed exactly a lot of the things she told. But then as children, we were told to listen to it and just abide by it.
I really agree with your point about why the embellishments were necessary. And even among African mythological figures in general, which I'm fascinated by, I find Anansi in particular to be very interesting. And it's also and unique in particular because he's actually, if you think about it, he's probably the most popular African mythological figure. Because in popular culture today, like not just within Africa, but beyond Africa as well. Because when you ask people generally about African gods, they may not really know much, but most people have some idea about Anansi because he is in like a lot of these days. I believe he's in like the American Gods TV show. There's I mean he's in books. And it's because his stories are a lot more detailed, the folk tales about Anansi, than a lot of other African mythology is. I think because, we did it orally and stuff, but for some reason, the Anansi stories have really, they've been preserved well. And
and I also think because like most mythological figures in Africa and everything, because of the migration that happened during like the transatlantic slave trade, and even till now, because we constantly migrate and everything, we keep telling these stories. And then because it's oral, people have different like versions of Anansi. And I think because Anansi is just like a trickster and a cunning person, so the like Cynthia said, the symbolism of his stories is in telling children and telling people really that you're leaving your country, but you can outsmart the people you're meeting, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think he's even popular in the Caribbean. Did you know about that, Cynthia? I just found out about that today, that Anansi is a popular figure, not even just in Africa, but in the Caribbean as well, that they identify with the stories and tell the stories to their kids and stuff.
Oh, and I found out another fun fact, you guys. So in Jamaica, you guys know the Jamaican patois. So that language is really inspired by Ghanaian, I think Chui, Akan, and something. from three different tribes. Yeah. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that's so cool. So that could explain why the Anansi story is really popular there.
Yeah, I actually heard that the thing about the Jamaican thing, about the origination
Patois,
of the
yeah.
name. The way in which I heard it is that so basically some people were taking from, people were taking from different parts of Africa, but mostly the people who were taking from the Akan, some of them were able to escape and get to modern day Jamaica. But then when they got there, they didn't know what else to do. And so in Akan Jama Yeka, it seems we're stuck here. And so when they got there, they were like, oh, Jama Yeka how? And so the word evolved and it became Jamaica.
That is so interesting, actually.
Extremely, honestly. So that means that's true. Like Jamaican patois is basically Akan languages watered down, probably.
Yeah, mostly. If there's this video I saw on YouTube where there was this really, really old man in Jamaica and he was speaking like the actual real deep patois, and it sounded a lot like Akan. There were a few words that were familiar to Akan, but then obviously as time goes on and as the language evolves, most of the things get lost and the language changes.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it also explains why, like, the popularity of Anansi then, like, why he's...
Yeah. I was actually looking into it and I found that apparently he was kind of like a symbol or beacon of like resistance of slaves.
Yeah.
He inspired them to resist, slavery and like plot ways to escape.
Yeah.
Because of the conning and stuff. And I think that's...
I read this account of like a former slave owner, this white man in the Caribbeans, but he's all those white Caribbean people that own slaves. And he was saying how some of his slaves used to trick him with stuff they heard from Anansi stories. I don't know how true that is, but some of the ways they used to like con him and stuff, it was stuff they got from Anansi stories. I'm like, wow, that's very interesting.
That just really shows you the importance of these folktales. I mean, we think of folktales and folklore as kind of like, it's by the way, it's kind of nice and it's a nice part of culture, but we don't actually really see the real world significance and results. But then when you think about how Anansi apparently had this effect on slave resistance, it makes it so real that that actually gave them inspiration.
Yeah. And Anansi, I think in Nigerian stories, he's like the tortoise, like when Cynthia was saying this story. Because I'm like, these things Anansi gets up to. That's what the tortoise used to do.
The tortoise was always the smart one, wasn't he? The one that would trick people. And also, when you think about like trickster gods within other cultures, for example, in the Yoruba culture, I believe there was Ishu, who is a trickster god. And mistakenly, or I don't know, but that was translated, when they translated the Christian Bible into Yoruba, the person who translated it called Ishu Satan, and then people started associating Ishu with Satan when in reality he was supposed to be a trickster god similar to Anansi. And there's like Legba, I believe, I'm not sure exactly what culture that's from, and even beyond the shores of Africa, like Loki in Norse mythology, there are just trickster gods everywhere. So I think generally most societies have realized the importance of teaching their children and their people why wit and like it's important to have more brains than brawn.
Clever, yeah. I don't know if I agree with that though, because I think sometimes it's not just about being clever or trying to outsmart people, but it's a necessary skill to have.
No, definitely, we know that. Like, even if you are the smartest person in the world, like you cannot dodge a punch fast enough. Somebody might still be able to punch you, but at least people know that they can resist force in some way. So when there's a force bigger than you, maybe you will lose the fight, but you can make it pain them. You know what I mean? Like you can get even a bit, which is like kind of goes back to the slave resistance things that they knew that they didn't have a way of beating the British. They didn't have the equipment. They probably didn't have the people or whatever. But then they had the small things that they could do, like
they had their wits basically.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end of the day, you might not even win. You might not win the fight, but you don't lose your like dignity or you don't lose your pride. For example, the Igbo landing, the people that chose to instead like commit suicide rather than become slaves, and they jumped off the slave ships.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's no winner in that scenario, but then at the same time, they might still think of themselves as winners because they would have preferred,
To
liberty.
die and become slaves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, Cynthia, do you have any other like Anansi stories? I saw one about Anansi and the watermelon. I saw Anansi, and honestly, there are way too many Anansi stories.
A lot.
Interesting.
A lot.
Like a lot.
There are a lot. And some of them were not really stories that he was in. Some of them were stories that people believe that he told. And so for some of them, he wasn't even like directly in the story. It was just stories that he told. And there are a lot of them. I can't even, there are so many of them.
Yeah.
But he told one about fufu. He told one about why the history behind fufu, and the people wanted to know. So he told them that a long time ago, Nyame, who was the sky god, was so close to the earth. And then there was this old woman, she really loved to eat fufu. And I don't know about the Nigerian culture, but in Ghana, the fufu is usually pounded in a mortar with the pestle.
That's similar.
Yeah, so this old woman loved to eat fufu, so she was always pounding fufu. But anytime she pounded the fufu, the pestle hits Nyame, who is the sky god, who was at the time believed to have been so close to the earth. And so he always got disturbed by this woman pounding fufu. So he decided to move further up so that he doesn't get disturbed by it. So that is why Nyame, who is the sky god, is far from the earth. And as silly as that story sounds, it's actually funny.
It really is.
It is funny. I like how some of the stories are kind of teaching a lesson and whatever, and then some of them are just practical. Like, look, the noise is too loud. That's why they run away.
Yeah.
I think it kind of makes sense. They're using these stories to understand the reality, if that makes sense. Like, we need to understand why the sky is not so close to the ground. So people are like,
yeah,
you know what?
exactly.
Anansi said this story and we're sticking with it.
That's true.
All right, Cynthia, this has been so informative and very interesting. Thanks for sharing this story.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed learning
having me.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you like this episode. You should like it and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.
Yeah, and don't forget to follow us on all our social media platforms. On Twitter, we're Oriire_Africa, and Oriire is spelled ORIIRE_Africa. And on Instagram, we're Oriire_Africa. And you can check the website out at oriire.com. May that say it, Cynthia. That's thank you in Chui.
Also follow Cynthia on Instagram. Her Instagram is KC, that's CAYCEE_love. And her YouTube channel as well is Sit with K. That's SIT, of course, with CAY. And find interesting content over there. Ask her about Anansi stories. Let her tell you more. Also, if you have career-related questions, go to Cynthia. She's the plug.
Yeah.
And if you would like to come on our podcast and discuss myth, history, food within Africa, we would love to hear from you. We'd love to have you on. So you can just go on the website, oriire.com, and contact us. Contact us on Instagram, on Twitter, whatever. We're always available. Thanks for
send us an email.
Yes, at info@oriire.com.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Nanteye. I don't think I said that properly, but that's goodbye in Chui.